Hey everyone, my name is Mike with Chronus, and just wanted to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Inclusivity through ERGs, a blueprint for business transformation. Before we get started with today's exciting event, I wanted to just go through some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so you will receive a recording within about 24 hours after today's event. And if you're joining us live, this is approved for one SHRM recertification credit. So you'll receive that code in the follow-up email. And we are going to have some time for some Q&A after today's fireside chat. So if you have questions for our presenters, our panelists today, be sure to pop those questions into the Ask a Question module. I'm just going to highlight that for you on your screen right now, and we'll get those questions answered. So I'd love to know where everyone's from. So I'm located in Auburn, Washington, just a few miles outside of Seattle, but pop your location in the chat, and love to see where everyone is joining us today. And as you're doing that, I also wanted to introduce our speakers today. So I'm so excited to have Lydia Frank and Laura McGee with us, two women leaders. So excited to have the two of you on the panel today. Laura, would you like to just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your company? And then Lydia, if you could do the same, that would be great.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. Great to see you today. Dialing in from Toronto, Canada, truly Toronto, Canada. I'm the CEO and founder of Diversio. We are a diversity and inclusion data and resourcing company based globally, headquartered in Toronto. Lovely to see you all.
And hello, everyone. I'm Lydia Frank. I'm VP of Marketing at Chronus. We are a mentoring software platform. We also, have people using us to manage ERGs as well. And in terms of my background, I have done a lot of writing, speaking on topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and kind of how to correct, in workplace inequities and kind of solve those issues. And ERGs are such a huge part of that, of an effective strategy. And we really want to walk you through how they can be even more effective in terms of transforming your business.
Yeah, I was so excited to dive into this topic, and but I wanted to just start off a little light, little easy with an icebreaker question. Lydia, I'm going to ask you first. So, how have different communities that you've been a part of throughout your career helped you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Mike gave me a little heads up on this icebreaker question, but I think a lot about kind of the women that have been part of my career journey up to this point. And being in a tech company most of my career, women aren't always super well represented. And so that's been so important to just have that support and be able to really talk about that experience and, feel that you're not alone, when you're having those hard moments. And also getting that extra encouragement to kind of advocate for yourself in certain moments where you feel like you're maybe not getting the support that you need or the kudos that you deserve. And it's been kind of a magical aspect, I would say, of my own career, is just being able to tap into that strong female network and feel supported and buoyed by that throughout my career.
Maybe I'll pile on. For me, so my background is in corporate. Spent most of my career at McKinsey, and I remember one of the most formative periods of my time there was being part of the women's ERG, which, to everything Lydia said, was great for development, coaching, guidance, mentorship. But what was really fun was when we started to engage actually the men as allies in the company. And in one area in particular, we identified across the board that women were lacking in sponsors, and we weren't really being as adequately mentored as our male peers. And so we challenged senior leaders at the company and actually beyond to personally lean in and sponsor our high potential women. And it went far and wide. It went viral. It was really cool. So it was really interesting to see the internal benefits kind of within the group and then our ability to drive change within the company.
Yeah, I just love what you just said there, Laura, to drive change within the company, within the organization, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. I'm sure everyone is familiar with ERGs, but if you're not, then ERG stands for Employee Resource Groups. Companies also call them affinity groups, employee networks, but they're all voluntary employee-led groups within a company. And and I've been fortunate to join Chronus because this is the first company that I've been a part of that have ERGs, and it's being able to be a part of a community like what you and Lydia just talked about is so valuable to to feel connected with people like me or with shared beliefs. And so I just want to dive a little bit more into how ERGs can become that engine for inclusivity and organizational connectedness. And Laura, well, this is actually a question for the two of you, but Laura, I'd love for you to start this. So, what role do ERGs play in promoting that inclusive and equitable workplace culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, we always want to start with the business case. That's what will drive that sticky long-term change. But at the ground level, from the employee perspective, we see improved connections, coaching, mentorship. It's a great way to surface for senior leaders who are the dedicated kind of top talent members of your team. Of course, driving word of mouth and employee referrals can help with recruiting and hiring. So really a number of different ways it drives retention, engagement, et cetera. But internally at Diversio, as I mentioned, we are a data platform. And so we measure and track inclusion within our client base. And kind of hot off the press, we've been analyzing longitudinal data. So about 5 years of inclusion score performance improvements across our client base. And we found that ERGs are one of the top drivers. So again, statistically significant longitudinal contributors to an improved sense of inclusion and belonging in a company. So really creating that sense of belonging and connection can go a long way to achieving those goals.
Well, and I would say too, when you're thinking about an inclusive and equitable workplace culture, what makes it that way is that people truly do have that sense of belonging. It's someplace they want to show up and work every day. You want to feel as an organization like you're able to not just hire diverse talent, but you're able to keep them, right? And they're engaged. And ERGs are such a critical part of that, developing that sense of belonging and that sense of engagement and really retaining folks and making them feel part of the organization. And I think another piece of that too is if you're thinking about how to make your workplace more inclusive and equitable, is how you tap into the voices that you have, this really powerful resource in the ERGs of understanding those voices of underrepresented employees in your organization. If you proactively seek out that input, you can do things like really tailor benefits to particular groups and make sure that you're meeting their needs. You can, really think about career development. Are you ensuring that everybody gets what they need to advance in their career and move forward? And I think what anybody working in DEIB for any period of time knows is that, equal and equitable aren't the same thing. It's like we spend probably so much time explaining that to others. I'm sure so many of you on this call have as well. But what somebody needs to get to that equitable outcome is not exactly the same as what somebody else needs. And so I think if you harness that underrepresented, kind of voices that you have in those ERGs, it can be so powerful.
Yeah, and we've seen this happen within organizations, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But it can be super transformative. And Laura, I'm super excited to get my hands on this report. I believe it's coming out sometime next year, and everyone on this call today, we'll do our best to make sure that you're aware of that piece of research. But you said that the research really proves out that investing in DEI, ERGs can really drive business performance. And I wanted to touch a little bit, dig a little bit deeper on that. So how can you just ensure that your ERGs are inclusive and representative in your workforce so that you could have those positive business outcomes?
It's a great question. And in particular, if you are the head of DEI for a company or a CHRO, you've got a limited budget, you want to make sure that you're investing in a program or, an initiative that's going to have a return. We get a lot of questions from our clients, where do I even begin? And so we like to start with data. And so step one typically is we suggest get a picture of who is represented at your organization. And in particular for those, invisible characteristics. So maybe, a different socioeconomic background, maybe part of the LGBT community, et cetera, et cetera. It's really important to have a way for employees to self-identify safely, anonymously, so that you understand who's represented, who's in the company. And then step two for us is, okay, now that you understand who's there, who's at the table, what is their experience? And in particular, you're looking for any gaps or pain points across specific groups that could be benefited by some sort of resource or affinity group. So for example, in our data set, we often find that racial and ethnic minorities might not experience the feedback process in a fair and equitable way in the same way that maybe white employees do. Or women might be, again, lacking for those mentorship and sponsorship opportunities. So the idea is for a company, once you understand who's at the table, who's in the company, where are the pain points and gaps in experience, that helps you to start prioritizing what groups would really benefit from this sort of resource. And then from there, that's when you start standing up the groups and, all the best practices around recruiting someone to join it, assigning an executive sponsor, creating a budget, implementing programming, of course, should be employee-led, employee-driven, and then ultimately tracking the impact. Again, for us, we do it through inclusion scores, but you can look at things like retention, trends, promotion trends, all that good stuff.
And being Asian myself, I like some of those things that you said really touches me deeply, because I felt some of those inequities throughout my career. And you also said safety. So belonging and psychological safety, they're cornerstones for that business transformation. And without these pivotal factors, it's really hard to drive some of that business success that you're talking about. And I just want to explore some how these ERGs continue to play this pivotal role in reinforcing sense of belonging and creating that psychological safety in the workplace. And Laura, I'm going to continue to ask you to talk more about this, but how do ERGs reinforce that sense of belonging and psychological safety?
Yeah, it really it's funny. We see that ERGs, they really tend to develop a character that's really specific to obviously the employees in the ERG, but it's also influenced by the company culture. And so, if there are significant harassment issues going on in the company, we find that ERGs tend to be a place, of course, of moral support, but also a way for employees to come together and maybe speak with a voice that they wouldn't have found on their own. So being able to safely bring issues to the HR department, maybe a trusted leader, maybe the executive sponsor. Of course, you want those issues surfaced. The worst thing that could happen is it goes undetected. So I think there's power in numbers is one thing. And then again, I think having that safe space to have those discussions and get advice and feel like you're not so isolated, it's a great way for maybe the less, I'm going to say inflammatory topics, like maybe it's being passed over for promotion or not, getting a project sponsored that you wanted to. All of what might be felt as microaggressions, it's great to have a place in a group of people, in particular if there's executive buy-in, to make you feel like you're supported along the way.
I would also chime in to say, I think the concept of code switching has been talked a lot about in kind of DEI circles. And I think that's a really important aspect of kind of what ERGs are helping with is it's exhausting, right? For somebody that is underrepresented in an organization, feeling like they have to show up in a certain way and constantly feeling like they have to, transform the way that they're, kind of acting in front of, their coworkers. And the ERGs, if it's you have a group of folks with shared identity, shared background, you can drop the code switching a bit. You can drop the mask. And it's not something that everybody's going to understand. If you are in the majority and have been the majority of your career, and in a particular workspace, it's maybe hard to understand. But for those that are having to show up and don't feel maybe safe to communicate everything they're feeling and experiencing in a larger group, they need that smaller group to connect with and say, like, this is what I'm going through right now. What should I do here? So it is such a, I think, important aspect of that, creating that sense of belonging.
And fun fact for the audience, Lydia and I used to work together prior to Chronus, and Lydia was our DEI champion at that company. And Lydia, you probably don't remember this, but we had a conversation around just diversity, and I felt like I had to wear a mask at work, and we talked about that. So your comment there just reminded me of that. And and I didn't know too much about D&I back then, but I obviously know a lot more about it now. And you were an ally for me back in those days. And so I just wanted to ask you, and Laura, I'd love your thoughts on this too, but like, what role do allies play in ERGs today?
It's such a good question, and I'm so feel a little heart flutter there, Mike, to hear that story. That makes me really happy to know that was your experience. I think, when I'm thinking about the role of allyship, I do think it's so critical. I think it's important both, though, to have that safe space where people can come together with people of a similar identity and background and really be able to just share. So allies aren't always needed in every moment, even if they are invited in at certain times, right? So it's still needed, kind of that safer space with folks who have that kind of shared identity. But where I've seen it be most effective, and I've had the opportunity, thankfully, over my career to connect with lots of different organizations doing this type of work, and trying to figure out the best practices and the right ways of kind of rolling this type of strategy out at their organizations, inviting allies in at certain moments to say, hey, we can't actually transform the organization and make it a more inclusive place without allies, right? So I think it's so important to make sure. I was reading an article recently, actually, about ineffective ERGs can feel exclusionary, right? And that's not what you want. You don't want to say, we've created all these ERGs, and if you're in the majority, you don't belong anywhere. You belong over there. You want to find a place where allies can plug in and really highlight for them how they can help make the organization more inclusive, and help them understand the experiences that they haven't had, that their colleagues are having. And so I do think that that's such a critical piece, but I think you need both. You need the safe space to have those conversations, and then you need places where you are asking the allies to plug in.
I think all great points. For me, it comes down to, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve with the formation of an ERG? And then what does the data tell you? So I think, to your point, Lydia, we find if the challenge being faced by that group is something like psychological safety, often we'll find when we ask employees, they want to keep it a closed group setting. Or there will be times throughout the year, maybe after a really unfortunate public event where folks want to rally together and gather support from one another. The ERG may say, look, for this event or for this period of time, we're going to close our doors and keep that feeling of safety. On the flip side, if the problem is something like access to networks, that's a really great opportunity to bring in allies and do some education and networking to make sure that members of the ERG have opportunities. And again, you're promoting the benefits of the group. So for me, it's a combination of, again, what are you trying to achieve? What is the data telling you about what the problems are? And then, of course, asking the ERG, what are folks comfortable with? What would most benefit them in their development, that sort of thing.
I would also call out really quickly that I've seen some organizations create an ERG for allies. That's another route you can go. I think that the only danger there is if you don't invite in the collaboration across ERGs. You don't want to get a group of people together that says, we want to be allies, but we're not actually going to ask what underrepresented folks need us to do. We're just going to figure it out. It's like you want to make sure if you have that unique group that there's a partnership there.
I love that last point, Lydia. It's I can only imagine how confusing it would be to want to help but not know how to help. That could be confusing and very frustrating, I bet.
Yeah.
So, I want to pivot our discussion to some of the fundamental aspects of the things that kind of underpin organizational success through ERGs, and that's connectedness. And Lydia, like in our prep calls, like you talked a lot about connectedness and what that means and why that's so important. And so I'd love for you to just explain to the group what you mean by that and why it's so important in your mind.
Absolutely. And I would say, organizational connectedness is very core to what we do at Chronus. It's a big piece of what we think about when we're thinking about development and how that's achieved. We think the people part of that is so important. And so we spend a lot of time talking about organizational connectedness and just connectedness in general. At the core of it, I don't think this is my opinion on this is going to be a surprise to anybody, but people thrive when they're connected, and they wither in isolation is my feeling. Even if you're an introvert, you can't stay completely isolated. It's just so challenging. I was, looking at some research from Gartner recently on this as well. And what they call out is just 1 in 4 employees feel connected to their organization's culture, but people who do feel connected to that culture have a 36% boost in performance and retention. Just well-connected organizations just collaborate better, they communicate better, they innovate better. And I think I saw someone mentioning this in the Q&A a little bit here, asking about kind of the hybrid aspect. It's become even harder, right, to foster that connectedness when 8 in 10 employees who can be remote are either hybrid or remote right now. That is just the reality of our workplace. It has shifted so much, since the start of the pandemic. But what the research is telling us is it's not going anywhere. Hybrid's here to stay. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, and we have to kind of deal with it, right? So I do think that thinking about the role of connection in your workplace is so critical to ensure you achieve all the other outcomes you want around engagement and productivity and retention and all of these things. And ERGs can play such a critical role there because you can't rely on just the connection between manager and employee when you're in these remote situations or hybrid situations. You need people to feel connected in a myriad of ways within the organization, to their manager, to their colleagues, to people within an ERG who are similar in them, as similar to them in some aspect. And so I think it's so critical to really think about how you bridge that gap.
That hybrid remote piece is a good call out. And I think I read an article that also said that there's a biological impact, a physiological impact to being remote. Staring at somebody through a screen, it's your body, your physical body feels and takes that differently. So finding ways to connect beyond the screen through these ERGs, could be a great way to improve those connections. But along those same lines, Laura or Lydia, what role can ERGs have in improving that connectedness?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, I think that connection piece can't be overlooked, and I think there's a reason engagement surveys ask whether you have a best friend at work because it's important, right? That aspect of feeling really truly a part of the organization and feeling like you're seen and valued and understood. It's just so critical to kind of, to your point, Mike, to employee well-being, to your sense of whether you're part of the larger organization. And, you know, I do think it's really critical to think about each employee's network. Like, who are they connecting with within the organization? And how can you help foster that? Because it isn't necessarily going to happen on its own. And we're seeing a lot of, you know, new hires, especially during the pandemic or kind of post, when we're in this hybrid world, the turnover rate, you know, just being really high in certain instances, because people don't feel super connected, right? And so from an ERG perspective, you know, I think a lot about how it really plays this role of understanding. You know, you're communing with people who have a shared identity, shared understanding, some shared lived experiences, and you feel more understood and you feel less alone, right? I do think it's really important, you know, in hybrid to figure out how you make that work. I mean, there's aspects of, you know, if you're centralized and you have lots of different kind of locations, are there ways to build up chapters within ERGs? You know, where people can get together, where they are in person? Are there ways to make the group feel connected that isn't always kind of over a video conference, you know, whether it's discussion boards or, you know, kind of other aspects that are async, even shared projects, like, you know, are they working on something together to a shared end that's going to be impactful for the organization? So I think really thinking about how you tap into that sense of community and help foster that through those ERGs.
And maybe to pile on, to put a bit of a data point, anyone who's looking to make perhaps the case to their CEO for investing in ERGs, there was a study covered in Fortune magazine a while back, finding that millennials would take on average a $7,000 pay cut to work at a company with a better culture fit. So there's a real business benefit to creating that sense of connectedness. And the way we think about it at Diversio is ERGs are a shortcut. So you can spend your time trying to find that work best friend, that sense of community, or you can accelerate that process, help bring people together and foster that spirit, especially in a remote environment, goes a really long way to keeping people around.
I'd also love to hear from the audience. If you have any good stories around how your company fosters connectedness, share them in the chat, and we could spend some time at the end, you know, just reading some of your own experiences. And I'd also love to understand, and I'm sure Lydia and Laura, you would too, but you know, how many of you have ERGs within your organization? My guess is quite a few, but I'm just going to start a quick pulse check here. You should see a thumbs up, thumbs down on your screen. If you have an ERG, hit that thumbs up. If you don't, hit that thumbs down, and we can get a sense of where our audience stands. But you know, I think we talked a lot about how ERGs could be that engine for, you know, for change. But you know, we're here to learn a little bit more than that, right? Like, we want to take ERGs to the next level, and we want to talk about how they could actually be a catalyst for business transformation. And this is really taking ERGs to that next level and thinking about what you know, what that looks like. So Lydia, you know, I want to start with you. Laura, please feel free to share any thoughts that come to mind. But what impact do ERGs have on productivity and company culture? And we talked a little bit about this. And how do these factors impact the overall growth and revenue of an organization?
Yeah, I would say, you know, productivity is a big topic right now for so many, especially in this kind of hybrid environment that many of us are operating in, and just, you know, lots of concern around that, lots of consternation about whether companies are as productive as they were previously. How do we get more productive? And all the data is out there really talking about how engagement kind of leads into more productivity. If you have, it's something like 77% of employees are actively, they're disengaged. They are either kind of passively disengaged or actively disengaged. So it's a very small percent that are actually engaged, right? And there's huge opportunity for movement. Because when you're disengaged, like, are you giving your best? Are you, taking it to that next level? And, I was reading this Harvard Business Review article. There's a study that was done by a company called BetterUp, and they were talking about that a high sense of belonging had been linked to a 56% increase in job performance, 50% drop in turnover risk, 75% reduction in sick days. And they called out that, for a 10,000 person company, it would result in an annual savings of more than $52 million. That's huge, right? Even if you don't believe that radically big number, just that, I think we all feel it at our core. If you do not feel plugged into your organization, you don't feel supported, you don't feel a sense of community, you don't feel a sense of purpose, all those things, yeah, you're not going to be doing your utmost, right? So how do we get more people feeling that way? And the evidence is really clear on ERGs. There's a reason why 90% of the Fortune 500 have ERGs in place. It's not just to do the right thing in a feel-good aspect. It's because it impacts the bottom line. It matters, right? But you have to do it effectively, certainly. It's not every ERG is created equal. And then you had also mentioned on the company culture side, we've talked about some of that in terms of listening to those underrepresented voices. What I think is so critical that I'd want to highlight there is the importance of acting upon that. Like, just asking for the input is one thing, seeking it out, fantastic. If you don't take it further and show that you're acting upon it, that can lead to further disengagement, right? If you create this ERG group and you say, we care about your needs and we're listening, but we're not going to do anything about it, that can make people feel even more, isolated, more of a sense of, I don't belong here. So I do think that's a really critical part, is how do you both seek out the voices of your underrepresented employees through these ERGs, let that be that conduit there, but how do you act upon it? As well as, kind of leaning into the leadership possibilities there. You have people who are volunteering to be part of these groups, to help lead these groups, who are demonstrating leadership. And if you really plug into that and help them plug into the organization, say, help me better understand, what's coming out of this group, and help be a steward of our culture here. If you really ask for that participation from those ERG leaders, it can be magical, the transformation that can happen.
Why aren't we doing more of this, Lydia? But go ahead, Laura.
One thing I'll add, I don't want to be the financial analyst on this call, but the way we've seen it play out, there's the cost side of the equation, which Lydia, you've captured perfectly. Definitely retention, happiness, productivity can be improved by ERGs. There's also the revenue side. And so we see this less commonly across companies. I wish it was more frequent, but leveraging ERGs for new product ideas, for new market entry, to understand what are the gaps in our service offering, what communities could we go after and better serve. We have one client, global entertainment company, and how we work with their ERGs is both kind of identifying risk in current offerings. So for example, reviewing content before it goes out, making sure that it's, communicated in a culturally sensitive way, making sure that it's not, inadvertently offensive, et cetera, but also new idea generation. So is there content that we're missing? Is there, a new channel that we could roll out? Is there a new type of platform that we might want to engage in? So I think that the exciting component becomes where ERGs become and really see themselves as a real profit center within the organization, really validating, the inherent value we all know that employees have. And then again, achieving some recognition across the business that, look, diversity does matter here. It is extremely good for business, and there is a reason to keep investing.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, you're jumping ahead a little bit, Laura, because psychological or psychically maybe, because I do want to ask about how we could tap into ERGs, for things like product development. So, sneak peek there, but no, you're absolutely right. There's been too many studies that prove the value of diversity and the impact that it could have on an organization. And I read this other study. It might be the same ButterUp study, Lydia, that you mentioned. They said that DI functions within an organization. They found 50% decrease in turnover, 167% increase in net promoter score, and a 75% reduction in sick days, and a 56% increase in job performance. Like, those are super compelling numbers to help convince organizations to do more with their ERGs. And but you also touched on this, Laura, like how do you, but part of that is like keeping track of the data and really proving this out through numbers. And wanted to ask you, like, how can you measure and track and improve the performance and success of ERG programs, because that's difficult to do.
Definitely. And Mike, I'm sorry for jumping ahead. I should have saved the lead, but as I'm sure everyone can tell on this call, I love measurement, I love data. But the way that, one way to do it, the way that we do it at Diversio, is we start by creating a benchmark or a baseline for employee experience and inclusion. And so, we have a set of metrics common, similar to many engagement metrics, things like inclusive culture, career development, career advancement, workplace safety, et cetera. And the idea is that you create that baseline, again, cut it by demographic group or ERG group, implement the programming, and then reassess. And so maybe to make that real and kind of demonstrate how progress can be tracked, we had one client somewhat recently where we created a baseline. It was in earlier this year, actually. And we found they had a significant problem with their LGBTQ2+ community, where they scored quite low on career development. So they were at about a 2.5 out of 10, and not quite as bad, but also low on culture, so about a 5.3. And so the number one thing that we recommended for them was to stand up an ERG specifically focused on this group, resource it, provide a budget, really lean in and make it effective. And we just surveyed them about a month ago, and we found that career development had gone from 2.5 to 7.3 out of 10. So basically a tripling. And culture had gone from a 5.3 to a 6.7. So that's a pretty short turnaround for a big company, really meaningful results, and a really great indication that, hey, this, what felt like a small intervention, a small program, had a really meaningful impact for that community.
How would, I just want to double click on that a little bit more. So, when you're setting up these long and short-term benefits, and there to define these KPIs and data collection and goal setting, so like how do you actually do that?
So in terms of okay, I understand. So the number one thing I think is, in an immediate sense, is this client in particular asks us, like, what can I do to improve these scores, which we know are correlated with retention, with productivity, with engagement. And the number one thing for this particular company is it was a really efficient allocation of their resourcing. So the short-term benefit of standing up an ERG is they got a really meaningful employee-centric benefit for a relatively small amount of money. It also really helped them gain and maintain that buy-in at the executive level. And so we find across kind of the C-suite, no surprise, I'm sure, to anyone on this call, they love numbers, and they love any sort of ROI assessment to feel like that, especially in this economy, those resources are being well spent. And then again, we find in the HR space, anything that will help you communicate the impact of the resourcing goes a really long way. So building that case for ROI, for continued investment, the longer term benefit of having the KPIs and the data collection and the goal setting is that you're able to reinforce the importance for the business of continuing with the sort of investment.
You talked about impact. So do you have any data or evidence or customer evidence of the impact that ERGs have on retention, recruitment, and employee engagement?
We do, and actually some of that, Mike, will be included in the report that we put out in Q1. But as I mentioned, I think among the top quartile companies we looked at, we saw about a 12-point, which is quite a meaningful improvement across engagement. And again, the number one driver behind that, so the number one program that was most causationally related to that outcome was employee resource groups. And so again, if you're thinking about what to implement to improve those metrics, ERGs are certainly a good topic to consider.
So now here's where we did a little sneak peek, but Lydia, we talked in our prep about some of your ideas on how ERGs could have other impact on the organization that maybe some organizations aren't really thinking about. So how can companies leverage ERGs to help inform things like product strategy and innovation?
Definitely. Sorry, I was on mute there for a moment. I think, that absolutely is kind of an untapped area that not every company is leaning into heavily. And, I won't belabor it too long since Laura touched on a lot of that. But I do think, this aspect of how do you explore new markets? How do you think about testing messaging for specific demographics and getting that feedback? If you have strong ERGs within your organization and you can get that input before you're putting something out to market, how powerful, can that be? I think new product ideas is another aspect. Like, is there a way to, especially if you're developing for a new market, potentially, can you pull people together from those ERG groups and ask them to brainstorm, along with your product team? And I also think what can't be overlooked is this aspect of you really do every organization wants to become an employer of choice, and showcasing how you are supporting employees is a huge aspect of that, right? The more you lean into that support, the more your employees are going to talk about that, and they're going to spread the word. And it's, a kind of cyclical nature of you're investing in your employees and you're supporting them, and then they are spreading that kind of love out further, right? And also that community engagement piece, that's a really important part of your organization, especially large organizations are thinking a lot about kind of ESG, and like how they're leaning into different aspects of community engagement. Like, how can you leverage your ERGs for that as well, and plug into communities that your business interacts with or are part of, and could potentially support in a more proactive way. But your people participating in those ERGs might have some really specific ideas around that. So just making sure you're not overlooking kind of that important and powerful resource you have within the organization.
Lydia, can I maybe add an anecdote? Because I love your point around new product development. I'll never forget this. I remember having lunch with the CEO of one of the UK's biggest gaming and gambling companies. Really big Scottish guy, very frankly macho, nice guy. But I remember he had mentioned to me his top priority across the business, all functions, was recruiting and engaging more women. And when I asked him, why are you doing that? Is it the right thing to do? Is it a moral case, et cetera? And he said, I looked at our data and I observed that 80% of our customers are men. And I observed that 80% of our employees are men. And his goal was to aggressively grow the company. And in his mind, the lowest hanging fruit was, entering an entire new demographic. And, one of the key things that he stood up initially was a women's employee resource group. And absolutely it was a place for support, et cetera, but really it was a think tank and an area for them to identify, again, low-hanging fruit. How can they attract an entire new customer base? And if you think about the size of that opportunity, it's massive. Yeah. So I thought that was kind of a pretty simple but powerful, for me, anecdote of, how this can be such a driver.
Well, and I think that's a great example of showcasing to people participating in the ERGs that it has buy-in from leadership, that it is an important piece. Like, I saw one of the questions, I know we're going to get to some audience questions shortly, but I saw somebody had asked about, how to get, people to participate when they feel like it's one more thing to do on their to-do list. And you have to showcase that the organization thinks it's important too, and that it derives value. And it looks to those groups to identify leaders and, those kinds of things. If you're demonstrating that the ERGs are not just something you're doing for employees, but that you're weaving it into the fabric of how you operate and how you understand kind of different perspectives, you're going to indicate to employees that, hey, this is not only is this a good support for me, but it's a career developer potentially.
And I think that acknowledgement piece of saying, it's not just, hey, we're just going to create employee resource groups because that's what our employees want, but the effort to go to those groups and ask them for opinions and identifying future leaders, like that shows to everyone within the ERG and everyone else in the organization that you're serious about this. Like you do actually see these groups as an untapped source for new ideas, leaders, and all of that stuff. And I think that's the big difference between just having an ERG and having ERGs that can really drive organizational change. And Lydia, you touched on this just a few minutes ago when you were talking about how can organizations weave the work that their ERGs are doing into their fabric and mission. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that. And this is going to be our last question because I'm just doing a time check, and we could probably talk about this forever, but I do want to get to some of these questions from our audience. But Laura, I want to start with you because you touched on this too, but what are some ways that organizations can weave the work that their ERGs are doing?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you think about it. Of course, a number of ways that you can go. We spent a lot of time talking about integrating ERGs into product development and new market entry. I think the biggest thing, though, is if you're looking at something like diversity and inclusion, those should be your champions. So if you're really kind of creating the ERG with the purpose and the resourcing, frankly, to improve experience, you'll find that quite naturally, those individuals become champions and ambassadors for the company. And so that's good for a number of reasons, including, of course, recruiting top talent. So I would say, step one is make sure those folks are empowered, make sure that they have the necessary budget and resourcing. And then, of course, again, data and tracking. So if you're able to share insights with the ERG about what's going on behind the scenes, so any insights that you glean from employee engagement surveys, for example, promotion rates, attrition rates, that will help them reinforce their programming. And again, tracking the impact of the programming that they might have rolled out will help the ERG to improve and refine what they offer. So I think it's a combination of, when it works, going out there and leveraging that success story, and then before it works, perhaps, or as it's working, using data and insights to empower the ERG and its members to really focus what they're doing.
I also would just quickly jump in and say, there's definitely a point I want to make, and I'm kind of like weaving it into this question that you asked, Mike, but I do think it's so important to think about career advancement for ERGs. And so, I think that is part of kind of your culture and how you're showing up for your employees and kind of that employee value proposition, if you will. But I think that is such a critical part of the ERG story as well, is how are you making sure that you're identifying specific needs around career development and leaning into that. It's a big part of, at least for our company, since we're really focused on mentorship, it's often how we hear about companies needing our services is that the ERGs are really instigating, like, we are craving this, we want mentorship within our organization, we want to advance our careers. And so they're requesting, these opportunities. And so I think that's a really important piece too, is making sure that ERGs aren't seen as this other thing, but it's also a key part of like how you're developing employees and how you're fostering culture and how you're informing culture.
Thank you so much for sharing. And, thank you so much for taking this time to speak with me about ERGs and how they could be real drivers for change within an organization. And now, I know we could talk about this for a long time, but let's go ahead and get to some customer questions or audience questions. And by the way, if anyone was curious, on my ERG pulse check, 56% of our audience work at companies that do have ERGs. So, not an informed group here. I'm going to ask some questions, and I'll direct it to one of you two. But if you feel like you can't take this question, or if you want to pass it on, feel free to do that. But Laura, I'll start with you. Jill asks, if you are a company with a centralized location and have satellite offices with low interaction between the two, how do you promote ERGs or develop ERGs in a way that's inclusive for all?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to Lydia's comment around hybrid being the new normal. Kind of a small example, but we found that online interactive board games have been a really effective icebreaker activity to bring some people together in person. Obviously, some folks really like that, but also engage people internationally. So I think team building exercises, pottery making was another idea that came from our team to deliver folks materials and have people come together creatively, engaging in an activity remotely while doing something physical and kind of IRL was, I thought, a great idea. So I think it's, leveraging if there is a software platform to facilitate engagement, of course, like any other area of the business, recurring meetings, expected attendance, excitement, engagement. I think all of those tactics play into ERGs as well.
Lydia, do you have any thoughts on how to promote in a hybrid?
Yeah, I mean,
or disconnected group?
I do think that you have to think of hybrid first a lot of times. If you have anybody that's not present physically, how do you make sure that how you're crafting an event or crafting a meeting kind of ensures that everybody feels included? And it can be things as simple too as, hey, if you have half the folks who are showing up in person and half are remote, everybody should have their camera on, right? In that instance, unless you've come to some agreement otherwise, but you want to make sure that the people that aren't in the room feel like connected to the people in the room, right? So there's that aspect. Or and even too, like, do you have a group camera where it's showing everybody, or does everybody have their laptop open so that you actually see everybody's face like you would if you were in person, right? And so it's just how do you bring that those folks together? I think it's too thinking about how you go beyond the group setting. We've seen lots of organizations do one-to-one kind of connections as well. Like, do you try to either foster individual times to kind of meet up and chat and get to know each other better and share experiences within the ERG versus always being a group meeting, especially if you do have people across locations? How do you foster those relationships and kind of help them get to know each other, like coffee chat kind of aspect? And, I think just, thinking too beyond, not everything has to be an event. So, are there other things that the ERG can do and be working toward together to kind of foster that sense of connection? We've even had, here internally, not that it was ERG related per se, but our head of people was having us across globally, having us participate in wellness activities where, if you had a Fitbit or you had any kind of, type of device like that, or even if you didn't, you were able to participate and say, like, we have a steps goal, you know, as a team, and we're trying to kind of achieve it together. You know, how are we working toward that? But we have half our company is based in India, you know, so we had folks in India and folks in the US kind of all working on this together. And it's, even if it feels, you know, silly, like it really can build that sense of team and connection and collaboration.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. So next question, and I don't know who to throw this to, so maybe I'll start with you, Lydia. Feel free to pass this on. Beth asked, can you talk about any risks or legal considerations to be aware of for ERGs? I would like to be able to talk to this with my organization.
It's a great question. I think in general, people can get nervous around any topic touching on DEI. And it really depends where you're seated. You know, we have customers who are based in Texas or other places where there are laws on the books that right now where you can't even say diversity or DEI. And so it kind of depends where you are. One thing I would say though is we had a great relationship at my last organization. I did a lot of work around pay equity in particular. So you can imagine there's a lot of legal considerations when you're talking about pay, and how DEI, you know, kind of plays into that. But we had a great collaboration with our legal team, because what they always said, you know, the reaction often from organizations and legal folks within organizations was like, ooh, you know, that seems like a quagmire, like let's not get into it, right? It could be something that blows up in our face. And our legal team always on the flip side said, yeah, but if you don't address like the issues that exist, the inequities that exist in your workplace, what kind of bombshell is that? You know, that also could blow up in your face, even if you're not, as you know, especially if you're not proactively trying to solve those things. So, you know, they really tried to turn the conversation around to say, you're putting yourself at risk by not being proactive and not trying to understand how you address these inequities. Like turning a blind eye does not protect you. So, you know, I think that that's an important conversation to dig into, but it's also, you know, I think it's important to push through that a little bit if you're getting resistance from certain folks within your organization, and legal folks in particular, is to push a little harder and say, hey, let's really sit down and talk about this. And I'm happy to share some resources too on that, but I always found that so helpful in trying to counter that argument.
Thank you, Lydia. And okay, so I think we have time for one last question. And Laura, I'm going to direct this one at you. This is a really good question. How do we motivate people to become an advocate for the ERG in addition to their regular job? Very often people see ERG participation as something extra that they think they should be doing.
I love this question. I'm very happy to end on it. I think it harkens back to something I said earlier in the call. One of the biggest business benefits of ERGs for the company is identifying top talent and future leaders. And so to really effectively achieve that, and I think, Lydia, you put the career advancement priority very well, you need to make sure that that engagement is happening. And so the people who step up and take this on as an additional responsibility and are driving benefits for the business, they should get exposure and recognition by the leaders of the company. And so having that executive sponsorship is critical, but also, you know, this is important work. Sharing that across the executive team, the management team, giving folks credit on performance reviews for, you know, extracurricular work that is clearly having a benefit to the company. Those opportunities should be created and should be really core to the HR teams executing ERGs. So for me, it's really not about, you know, ERGs getting together on their own time in a dark room and talking to one another. It really is, that should be a source of insight and talent identification for the broader leadership team.
Absolutely. And I would just chime in really quickly, like there's lots of debate around this, but you know, some organizations choose to provide some compensation for those leaders who are doing voluntary work above and beyond. You know, and it can be something you do or don't do, but it's worth talking about, right? If you're not doing direct compensation, to Laura's point, how are you rewarding those folks for stepping up? Because they're doing something extra for your organization, and they should feel like it's worth it.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much again. We're at time. By the way, Laura, it looks like the sky's on fire behind you. It looks very cool.
I'm so
hope it's
sorry.
hot.
I know it's Canada gets dark early.
But thank you so much for your time. Thank you, audience, for spending an hour of your time with us today. If you want to learn more about Chronus and Diversio, our websites are on the slide right now. And you can also check out the information that we'll send you in our follow-up. So thank you once again, and have a great rest of your day or evening.
Thank you,
Thanks so much,
everyone.
everyone. Take care.